There is a moment you recognize even if you've never named it, a narrow internal pause that appears just before you avoid the thing you said mattered to you. Nothing external has collapsed. The task is still possible. The time still exists. But something inside you tightens, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt momentum. Your attention drifts, your body hesitates, and without any conscious refusal, the urgency fades. You don't feel failure in that moment. You feel relief, and that relief is precise. It arrives quickly, cleanly, without argument, which is exactly why your brain remembers it. Relief teaches faster than intention ever could. The nervous system relaxes, tension drops, and the body registers the outcome as successful regulation. Step away, feel better. That lesson doesn't need language. It doesn't need reflection. It installs itself quietly beneath awareness and waits. The next time a similar moment appears, the pull happens sooner. It feels natural, reasonable, almost responsible. And if you pay attention, you'll notice something unsettling. The avoidance doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like intelligence conserving itself. This is where the pattern becomes dangerous, not because it's irrational, but because it works. A thought surfaces about what you should do. Before it fully forms, your mind runs a rapid internal simulation. Effort, strain, the possibility of disappointment, the familiar weight of self-judgment. That simulation never reaches consciousness as fear. It registers as discomfort, and discomfort nudges behavior just enough for you to turn away. The moment you do, calm returns. The system closes the loop. No drama, no conflict, just efficiency. And each time this happens, the brain becomes more confident in its prediction that stepping toward effort is a problem already solved by stepping away. Notice how reasonable this starts to sound. Notice how easily it can be justified. That's not an accident. Avoidance at this stage is not a failure of discipline. It's skillful emotional regulation. You are getting better at protecting yourself from internal friction. And that's exactly why it becomes harder to stop. Because the behavior isn't punished. It's rewarded, not with pleasure, but with stability. And stability is one of the brain's highest priorities, even when it quietly conflicts with what you say you want. The cost doesn't announce itself. Nothing obvious breaks. Instead, something more invasive begins to happen. You start trusting your explanations more than your intentions. You learn how to make inaction sound sensible. You feel a faint irritation toward people who seem consistent, not because they're wrong, but because their existence threatens the logic you rely on to stay comfortable. Most importantly, you stop believing that effort will lead anywhere different. Not consciously, structurally. Certain possibilities no longer feel meant for you, not because you can't pursue them, but because your mind no longer predicts safety in trying. Over time, the behavior stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like evidence. Evidence that shapes how you see yourself. Evidence that quietly narrows the future without resistance. And the most unsettling part is this. Your brain is still doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is protecting you from perceived threat. The problem is that what it protects you from is effort, and what it may be costing you is meaning. And unless something interrupts this process, it will continue to protect you in the same way tomorrow, and the next day, even as the gap between what you want and what you live grows wider, without ever feeling urgent enough to confront. Once your brain learns that effort predicts internal strain, it doesn't stop at avoiding individual actions. It begins reorganizing your life around that expectation. Quietly, gradually, without asking for consent. This is where the problem stops being internal and becomes structural. Your routines, your defaults, the way your days unfold start bending toward the same goal your nervous system already adopted. Reducing exposure to discomfort. You don't wake up and design this consciously. It emerges as a side effect of repetition. And one day, you realize you are living inside a structure that keeps making the same decision on your behalf. This is deeply unfair, and that matters. You did not sit down and choose a life that makes discipline difficult. You responded, again and again, to what felt reasonable in the moment. Each small adjustment made sense. Each compromise felt temporary. But environments don't reset overnight. They accumulate. And once they are in place, they operate with a persistence your thoughts do not have. You can think differently for an hour. Your environment keeps answering the same way all day. When your energy dips, when your attention fragments, when your emotional defenses are low, you don't rise to your intentions. You default to what is immediately available. Not because you're careless, but because availability becomes meaning in those moments. What's close feels important. What's visible feels relevant. What requires preparation feels optional. The environment doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It simply presents one path as obvious and lets the other fade into abstraction. By the time you notice, the choice has already been made. This is where discipline quietly disappears, not through resistance but through omission. The demanding action never fully enters awareness as a real option. And because nothing dramatic happens when you choose what's easy, the nervous system registers the day as successful. Calm is preserved. Friction is avoided. The system works. And because it works, it repeats. Over time, this repetition becomes evidence again. Not just that you act this way, but that this is what makes sense for you. The environment doesn't just shape behavior. It manufactures a narrative about who you are allowed to be. What makes this feel like betrayal is that insight alone doesn't interrupt it. You can understand everything that's happening and still wake up inside the same structure tomorrow. Thoughts are flexible. Environments are stubborn. They persist even when your perspective shifts, which means awareness by itself doesn't restore agency. It often sharpens the discomfort because now you can see the pattern without yet being able to escape it. The brain continues optimizing for stability, even when that stability starts costing you things you can't quite name. Pay attention to what this does internally. Over time, effort begins to feel dramatic, excessive, out of proportion. Ease begins to feel justified. You don't just avoid action, you grow fluent in explaining why avoidance is appropriate. And the more fluent you become, the less urgency you feel to change anything upstream. The system doesn't need to trap you forcefully. It only needs to keep you comfortable enough to stay. This is the critical implication most people never confront. As long as discipline feels like something you must summon against your own life, your brain will continue interpreting effort as unnecessary strain. It will keep protecting you in the same way it always has, even as the gap between what you value and what you live quietly widens. And until something interrupts the structure itself, every attempt at discipline will feel like fighting the terrain you're standing on, not because you're weak, but because the ground has been shaped to resist you. If the system you're living inside were truly solid, if it were as stable as it feels, this conversation would end here. There would be nothing to interrupt, no entry point, no leverage. You would either submit to the structure or exhaust yourself fighting it. But that is not what actually happens. The same system that resists effort so effectively has a weakness built into it, and it's subtle enough that most people never notice it. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't look like power. It looks like something small, almost insignificant, and therefore beneath attention. The brain is efficient, but it is not wise. It optimizes for immediate regulation, not for truth, not for meaning, not even for consistency over time. It learns fastest from what happens first, not from what matters most. And this creates a structural vulnerability. While environments are persistent, habits are not symmetrical. They don't require equal force to start and stop. Initiation costs far more than continuation. The moment something begins, the nervous system recalibrates. What felt threatening moments earlier becomes tolerable once motion is underway. The brain doesn't argue with movement the way it argues with anticipation. This is where the system quietly contradicts itself. It avoids effort to preserve stability, yet once effort is already happening, it quickly adapts to it. The danger was never the action itself. It was the prediction of action. The discomfort you've been avoiding has always lived in the moment before engagement. not in engagement itself. And because the system spends so much energy preventing that moment, it accidentally reveals where it is weakest. Not in endurance, not in consistency, in starting. Most people respond to this realization incorrectly. They try to use it as motivation. They tell themselves they just need to push past the first resistance. That fails because it still frames discipline as force. What actually matters is that the system does not resist duration nearly as much as it resists initiation. Once something is in motion, the brain rapidly normalizes it. It updates its threat model. The internal alarms quiet down, and the environment, which was so powerful in preventing action, loses some of its influence once behavior has already begun. This is not encouragement, it's exposure, because it means something uncomfortable. The system that feels so dominant is not opposing effort itself. It is opposing the moment where identity might change. Starting something, even briefly, creates a crack in the narrative the environment has been reinforcing. It produces evidence that contradicts the story of who you are allowed to be. And that contradiction is destabilizing, which is exactly why the brain works so hard to prevent it. Here is the deeper implication. Discipline has never been about sustaining heroic effort. It has been about repeatedly entering the smallest possible moments where the system loses its grip. Moments so brief they don't trigger full resistance. Moments that feel too minor to matter. And because they feel minor, the brain underestimates them. It allows them. It doesn't defend as aggressively, but the system still has to respond to what actually happens. And when action occurs, even briefly, the internal prediction updates whether the brain wants it to or not. This is the fault line. The environment is powerful, but it cannot erase evidence once behavior occurs. Identity is fragile at the edges. It shifts not through declarations, but through accumulation. The system depends on keeping those edges sealed. Small starts threaten that seal, not because they are impressive, but because they are real. They introduce ambiguity into a structure that relies on certainty to survive. This is why discipline advice fails when it emphasizes intensity, passion, or transformation. Those trigger full resistance. They alert the system that something fundamental is being challenged. What works instead is far less dramatic and far more destabilizing. Behavior that begins without announcing itself as change. Action that is too small to argue with but too real to ignore. Not because it feels good, but because it bypasses the part of the system designed to stop you. Nothing has been solved yet. You are not free. The environment still exists. The nervous system still prefers relief. But now there is something new in the room. The knowledge that the system is not invincible, that it has a point where it yields without force. The next question, and the one that matters most, is what happens when those small interruptions stop being accidental and start being intentional, not as acts of discipline, but as a redesign of how behavior enters your life at all. Here is where the mistake usually happens, and where the system quietly regains control. The moment you realize that starting is the weak point, the mind rushes to turn that insight into a tactic. It begins planning. It begins optimizing. It starts watching itself start. And the instant that happens, the same defenses that once blocked effort simply relocate. What was once resistance to action becomes resistance to repetition. The system adapts. Not aggressively, not obviously, but efficiently. The small start that slipped through yesterday now carries meaning today. It is no longer invisible. It has been noticed. And once it is noticed, it begins triggering the same anticipatory strain you thought you had bypassed. This is why people who understand all of this still get stuck. Not because the insight was wrong, but because the system does not remain static. The brain is not fooled twice in the same way. It learns patterns faster than it learns values. Once a behavior begins repeating, once it starts hinting at identity change, the nervous system upgrades its defenses. The discomfort returns, not during the action but before it. The prediction sharpens. The hesitation reappears. And if nothing else changes, you find yourself back in the same place, wondering why something that worked briefly now feels heavy again. This is the critical distinction that almost no one makes. The leverage point was never the behavior itself. It was the way behavior entered the system. Starting small is not enough, because size is not the real variable. Visibility is. Meaning is. The system does not resist effort in proportion to difficulty. It resists in proportion to threat to identity. The moment a start begins to signal this is who you are now, resistance escalates. Not because the action is harder, but because the implication is larger. So the problem shifts again. It is no longer about forcing yourself to begin. It is about preventing the system from interpreting beginnings as declarations. This is where most advice fails, because it treats discipline as something you do, rather than something that is allowed to happen. When behavior feels like a statement about who you are, the nervous system intervenes. When it feels incidental, temporary, non-committal, it often passes through unnoticed. The difference is not motivation. It is framing at the level of threat detection. This creates an uncomfortable realization. The system you are up against is not broken. It is adaptive. It will continue adjusting to protect its current identity map, which means any approach that relies on repeated conscious effort will eventually alert the very defenses you're trying to avoid. This is why discipline framed as self-improvement collapses. It announces change too loudly. It invites scrutiny. It triggers the internal audit that decides whether you are allowed to proceed. And yet, this same adaptiveness reveals something important. The system does not block what it does not recognize as meaningful. It does not mobilize against what feels temporary, peripheral, or reversible. It saves its energy for perceived identity shifts. This is not strategy yet. This is exposure, because it means that the path forward does not involve convincing yourself to care more, or committing harder, or identifying as disciplined. In fact, those moves make resistance stronger. What matters is how little attention the system pays to what is happening. At this point, identity should feel unstable, not empowering, not inspiring, uncertain. Because the realization is not, I can change. It's that change has been happening the entire time, just in the direction of least resistance. The same mechanics that narrowed your life can widen it, but only if they are engaged without triggering alarm. The system must be interrupted without feeling attacked. And that raises a final, more uncomfortable question. If discipline fails the moment it feels like a personal project, what happens when behavior is no longer framed as self-improvement at all, but as something closer to environmental inevitability? Something that happens not because you decided to become someone new, but because the system no longer knows how to stop it. At this point, something important should feel different. Not lighter, not clearer, heavier but quieter. Because once you see that effort, identity, motivation, and even insight are unreliable tools, the mind loses its usual places to stand. There is no heroic role left to step into, no version of yourself to aspire toward. And that absence matters, because it exposes the final mechanism that has been shaping everything underneath. The system you've been fighting does not actually care what you want to become. It only responds to what repeatedly happens without friction. And when friction disappears consistently in one direction, choice erodes whether you intend it to or not. This is the part most people never reach, because it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like constraint. The realization is not that you can finally change, but that continuing in the same way is no longer neutral. Once the environment is arranged so that certain behaviors occur by default, opting out starts to feel like disruption. Avoidance, which once restored balance, begins to introduce tension of its own. Not guilt, not shame, inconvenience, inconsistency, a subtle sense that something is off. The system resists change only as long as change threatens stability. When stability itself shifts, resistance follows it. This is what inevitability actually means. Not forcing yourself forward, but but quietly removing the conditions that made backward movement effortless. Not deciding to be disciplined, but finding that not acting now requires explanation. The system that once protected you from effort can be made to protect continuity instead. And it does this without motivation, without commitment, without identity narratives. It simply follows the path that has been made easiest to stay on. This is not empowering, it's impersonal, which is why it works. Notice how different this is from self-improvement. There is no promise of becoming better, no declaration of change, no internal speech about who you are now. Those are signals the system has learned to block. What changes instead is what happens when nothing is decided at all. When the environment no longer presents avoidance as the cleanest exit. When starting is no longer a moment, but a default state you wake up inside. The brain doesn't feel inspired in these conditions. It feels uninterrupted. This is also why discipline at this level stops being emotional. There is no surge of pride, no sense of overcoming yourself. Those experiences depend on conflict, and conflict has been engineered out of the process. Behavior happens not because you want it to grow, but because nothing in the system meaningfully opposes it anymore. The absence of resistance is not motivating, it's disorienting, and that disorientation is often mistaken for boredom or emptiness or lack of passion. In reality, it's the nervous system operating without the constant push and pull it had learned to expect. Here is the final shift, and it is quieter than people imagine. When action becomes normal and avoidance becomes effortful, identity updates on its own. Not through affirmation, but through evidence that no longer contradicts itself. You stop asking whether you are disciplined because the question no longer serves a function. There is no struggle to explain, no behavior to defend. The loop that once fed on relief and avoidance has nothing left to reinforce. The system does not feel conquered. It feels repurposed. This is what rewiring actually looks like when it's honest. Not enjoying discipline, not loving routine, but no longer experiencing effort as a personal threat, no longer needing to convince yourself to act, no longer living inside a structure that asks you to fight yourself for access to your own life. The change does not announce itself. It doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like inevitability settling in the opposite direction. And once it does, the question is no longer how to be disciplined, but how you ever mistook constant resistance for freedom in the first place.